I recently finished reading Fairy Tale by Stephen King, and oh boy, it was alright. I enjoyed it a fair amount, and I want to talk about it today. I have some opinions on it. Not many. I mean, they're not super strong opinions one way or the other. Again, I thought it was pretty alright, but I still wanted to share them nonetheless. Stephen King is by far my most read author. I have read more books by him than I have by anybody else. Dan Simmons would be a close second, but I've read more than 30 books by Stephen King. Let me actually, now that we're here, let's just go ahead and check. I like to log these things, you understand. I've read 34 individual Stephen King books, not counting rereads. I've reread The Gunslinger like 5 times. I've read The Regulators 3 times. I've read It, The Stand, and Under the Dome twice each. I really like me some Stephen King, and I've gone through a number of his books. Most of the time when I've been reading King, the King that I've enjoyed, I liked a lot of the old 80s horror King. Fairy Tale definitely falls in the fantasy category, at least the latter half of the book does. It was a fairly quick read. It was 598 pages, but don't let that fool you. According to the internet, it was only about 152,000 words. Alright, so the basic plot of the book. Charlie, a teenage boy, saves the life of an elderly curmudgeon, Adrian Bowditch. The two form an unlikely friendship, which comes to reveal a magical second world down a stairwell inside Bowditch's shed. Charlie explores the land of Impus, accompanied by Bowditch's dog, Radar, only to discover that something terrible is happening to this fantasy land, and only he can save it. I was not super pumped for the book going in based off of the plot. The story didn't necessarily hook me. I read it because, mostly, honestly, because a friend of mine asked me to read it and wanted to know what I thought about it. So I gave it a read. I prioritized this book ahead of a couple others. Spoilers from here out. Charlie is our POV character. He's far from the best character King has given us. He's also far from the worst character. He certainly doesn't feel like a 17-year-old boy. However, Stephen King kind of gave up trying to write accurate children to the current day a while ago, which was probably a wise move. Charlie felt very goody two-shoes a lot of the times, even though King did go out of his way to try and make sure that we know that, oh yeah, he's not a Disney prince. He's kind of a dark asshole sometimes, and all right, sure, he has a bit of a dark history, but yeah, I'm just not 100% certain that I really bought that entirely. Sure, Charlie needed to be bad enough to be able to survive the tournament near the end of the book. It just felt like we were told he had a mean background just for the sake of it, right? Here, Bowditch, yeah, Adrian Bowditch was probably my favorite character in the book. He was just an old fucking curmudgeon, and Stephen King does good on his old curmudgeons. A lot of his older characters I tend to really enjoy. I really liked Ralph in Insomnia. I really liked the Judge in The Stand. I liked quite a lot of Stephen King's older characters. They end up being interesting to me for one reason or another, and he definitely pulled off with Bowditch. Bowditch was he was an old asshole. He was very sour about everything. That's just very fun for me to read. I don't know why I enjoy it, but just something about a charming old asshole, and Mr. Bowditch was definitely a charming old asshole. Definitely a bit of a coward, as it's pointed out through the end of the book. I believe it was insinuated that Bowditch could have been Charlie, for the most part. He could have taken the role that Charlie did end up taking. He could have been, the mystical prince that comes from the far-off land to save all of the people of Impus. He could have been, yet he ended up refusing overall. And, I don't think it was ever directly stated, but I do think that he could have been, which, fuck him for not doing that, right? But on the other hand, I still like him. He's still a fine character. There were a number of other characters in the real world, aside from Charlie and Adrian Bowditch, obviously, but none of them are really worth mentioning too much. I mean, there's Charlie's dad, sure, but he doesn't really play too much of a role in the book. There's a couple of Charlie's friends from high school, but again, that really doesn't play in too much. I guess, we can mention Christopher Pauli, but again, he really only shows up for the first third of the book. Doesn't have much of any kind of an effect on the rest of the book. He's one of the things that pretty easily could have been pulled out of the book for sake of brevity. King is guilty of overwriting here, as he often He very often is. When Charlie finally does get down into the fucking fantasy land, once Charlie does get down into Impus, he does start meeting some of the more interesting characters. There's, of course, the 3 members of the royal family. Leah, right, there's the horse lady, doesn't have a mouth. That's fucking interesting, right? I liked that. That was a weird little bit. You know, she's got a little fucking sore on the side of where her mouth would be because she's got to, like, fucking puncture through it so she can drink stuff and keep herself alive. And, you know, like, it's a, you know, like, it's pretty fucked up. I like it. That's interesting, right? We also get to meet Woody. I forgot exactly what his relation was to her. Woody's there. He's a blind guy, right? And, you know, that's something of note to mention. But other than that, he's just a guy that Charlie runs into and gives a bunch of exposition. And then Charlie also runs into this lady named Claudia. And Claudia, of course, is deaf. You know, her ears have, like, kind of flesh has grown over them or some weird shit like that. And she is deaf, and so she gives him some gifts to help him along his way. So obviously, Stephen King did this weird, you know, hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil thing with the 3 of them. Leah, the lost queen of Impus, right, for she can't speak. Woody, this dude can't see, and Claudia can't hear. So, like, there's some thematic stuff that he pulled through there. I'm not sure if he's just trying to allude to a specific fairy tale with that one, or if he did mean something deeper, but if King had some kind of a deeper intention with that, it was kind of lost on me. It feels like that was one of those things that he just, like, threw in there just, like, because. And, you know, like, I don't have a problem with it. It would have been better if he could find some way to have paid that off specifically. Maybe he did address that, and I'm just the dumbass, but who knows, right? There are, of course, the bad guys that are trying to take over Impus, and have successfully taken over Impus. I'm not going to mention all of them because there were a lot of them. As a matter of fact, this is after Charlie gets into Impus, the number of characters that we meet starts growing pretty exponentially, right? So we're definitely not going to be covering all of them. The main big bad enemy of the book, the big bad antagonist of the book, is a dude named Flight Killer, right? His real name is Eldon, but he has assumed the name Flight Killer. Leah and Eldon, the Flight Killer guy, they're siblings, and God, it's just a fucking mess. We get a lot of explanation about the backstory, and I gotta admit, I didn't care all too much about the backstory. It was purely serviceable. All the talk about royal bloodlines and whatnot, that shit always bores me, and is one of the things that has kept me traditionally away from fantasy. So, you know, like, I didn't really pay too much attention to that. None of that really stuck too much for me, so forgive me. Forgive me if I get some of the details mixed up here. When it comes to bad guys, this Flight Killer guy, this Eldon fellow, man, definitely not the best that Stephen King has made. You know, like, we're, you know, comparing this guy to, like, fucking Randall Flagg and Pennywise and Big Jim Rennie, right? Or to, like, Tack in Desperation, Regulators and shit. Like, there are so many other villains that are way better pulled off than this Flight Killer fellow. I'm not saying it was bad, it wasn't non-effective. I just didn't care for the most part. He was just okay. He was there. He was serviceable. He did what he needed to do, but I'm not gonna lose any sleep over not having read about this character more. There was, however, Hannah and Red Molly. Those 2 characters were kind of interesting. They were the giants. I liked them. Wish we could have seen just a wee little bit more of them. I did not particularly care how their situation was resolved. I thought it ended a little too quickly, a little too conveniently, but you know, I mean, that's Stephen King. The night soldiers were pretty cool. I liked the way Stephen King described them. You know, their blue auras and, like, fucking semi-translucent skin. That was pretty cool. That's one of the reasons that I really do like Stephen King. His imagination is fucking on fire, man. That guy can really see very crisply, very in extreme detail, all of the little bits and pieces of his story. Sometimes to his detriment, sometimes to his strength. And in this instance, boy, just the way he really described the night soldiers was just particularly effective. I am not going to be able to mention every single one of the prisoners that Charlie meets in this book, because there are a lot. There were a lot of prisoners in this book. There's supposed to be 32 of them in total, including Charlie. So that means that there are 31 other prisoners inside the dungeon with Charlie for like 150 pages worth of the book. That is a lot of people to have to learn in a very short time. I think there's a number of names that he drops like only once, I think. Sure, we have to try and like grow an attachment to these people because Charlie needs to grow an attachment to these people, but like we can still do that without dropping more names in and cluttering up the mix. I couldn't really keep many of them straight, which isn't, most of them died by the end anyhow, which is like, as a reader, that's kind of a nice thing. Like, it's terrible. Of course, we don't want these people to die, but it's kind of nice that I don't have to keep track of fucking 32 of them. He could have just resorted to anonymous names on the prisoners. I don't think that would have really detrimented the feelings that we're supposed to build up towards them. I will say there were a few that did stick out still, though. The best one was Clay or Claw. Not sure how to pronounce the name. This is a fantasy story. All of the names are up for fucking grabs. Nobody knows how to pronounce none of them. At least I don't. Claw, Clay, I don't know. I'm gonna call him Claw, because that's how it sounded in my head when I was reading it. I kind of liked him. It was kind of like Stephen King saw Dolph Lundgren in Rocky IV and was just like, I need him in my story. That's what I need to do. It's just kind of fun to see the little, like, David and Goliath story between Charlie and Claw. That was one of the more fun parts of the book for me, personally. I really liked the Snab. The Snab was just what a weird little guy. I love that little fucking thing. He's just a little red grasshopper. He's the lord of small things. What the fuck does that mean? I don't know, but I'm there for it. Aside from Bowditch, the Snab is probably my favorite character in this book, aside from Adrian Bowditch. I don't know what it is precisely about this character that just makes me just love him. I really like silent characters or characters that have almost nothing to say. And the Snab, I don't actually think had a single line of dialogue in the book. It was just there when it needed to be there, and it was great. And also, it controlling those fucking rats to come in and just like, nah, that was one of the more fun parts of the book. I love that shit. Stephen King went fucking overboard with the world building in this book, which, you know, like that is exactly to be expected of him, right? Having read The Dark Tower, having read The Talisman, having read The Stand and It, and all of these different books, he is a nut for world building. There are a few tidbits that I want to go ahead and point out that were just weird and cool. Some of the world building I love to just have be there. Sometimes pointless world building can still be good. Sometimes it's fun to just have things there that don't really affect the story, that don't push anything forward, but still kind of stand and justify themselves, and couldn't stand and justify themselves out in any other context. So there are a few moments like that in this book that, I enjoyed, and I'd like to remark upon them. The two moons of the story, sure, yes. Technically, the two moons existing did play into the story, but really only kind of barely, right? The two moons didn't have to fucking touch to have the Dark Well open up at the end of the book. That was absolutely unnecessary, but I mean, it was just there. He had the world building set up, so he might as well have used it, right? And so it was fine. I liked having the two moons. It made me think like fucking Tatooine. He clearly stole the Glass City from Wizard of Oz, but that's of course not the first time that he's stolen shit from the Wizard of Oz. Nor do I think it's going to be the last time that he's going to steal shit from the Wizard of Oz. I mean, there's no problem with that, of course. Wizard of Oz. I'm pretty sure the book is in the public domain now at this point. He also made allusions, of course, to Something Wicked This Way Comes. When Charlie gets to the city and he's trying to get to the sundial, the city is shifting around him as he's going, and you get this sense that nothing ever stays the same. It's all labyrinthine. That part's pretty cool. I enjoy that quite a lot. I do appreciate the Dark Tower references that he dropped throughout. I think there are other worlds than these. I think he dropped that one in there. In some ways, Fairy Tale is almost like two books stapled together into one book. The first third of it is really kind of detached from the last two thirds, right? The first third is about Charlie and Bowditch really forming this relationship together. And sure, Charlie is having to be his caretaker and, help him heal while Adrian's legacy is getting better and all that kind of stuff. But it really is just more about kind of growing up and learning to accept more responsibilities as an adult, or at least stepping up from being a child into being an adult. The story does kind of end when Bowditch dies, right? Charlie is a changed man at that point. He ends up receiving all of everything from Mr. Bowditch. In Bowditch's will, it all gets passed on to Charlie. So you really do get this sense that he is a bit of a different person by the end of the first act, right? It really could have been very self-contained story. The second and the third act is where we actually get to the fantasy land of Impus. I didn't feel a great emotional stir in the final two-thirds of the book, but the second two-thirds of the book is Stephen King fucking around and actually having some decent amount of fun, right? Just letting his imagination go wild. The last two-thirds of the book has almost nothing to really do with the first third of the book, other than the fact that the dog connects them. King could have written two different stories, right? And he chose to bridge them together. Not necessarily bad. I just thought that it may have actually benefited each story individually if he didn't pair them together. The Charlie and Adrian story together is touching and moving and, almost kind of like, closer to, a literary piece of work, something closer to The Body or Shawshank Redemption. On the other hand, we've got that last two-thirds that really does feel more along the lines of Eyes of the Dragon or Dark Tower, things like that. So those two stories really did feel put together simply because they could have been. And it worked okay. I just think it could have worked better if they weren't. Fairy Tale feels like it has a really lopsided two-act structure, where the first act is just kind of short and stumpy and not really in the same... really not even in the same league as the last two-thirds of the book. Reading it through, you can see how he gets from point A to point B at the very end of the book, but it still, I think, would have been served better if he would have broken them up and have two different books out of it, honestly. The ending was fine. I wasn't blown away with the end, but it was fine. It wrapped up everything that it needed to. It left a couple of questions unanswered, but that's fine. Not everything needed to be answered, especially in a fantasy story. Not everything needs to be answered. But he's delivered much stronger endings in the past. However, he's also kind of botched the ending of his books worse than Fairy Tale. It was perfectly serviceable. He had to find a final page somewhere, and I'm just glad that he did. This is Stephen King. He easily could have dragged the ending on for like another 130 pages just because he could have, and I'm just grateful that he didn't. In conclusion, this book certainly suffers from many of the problems that Stephen King's books usually suffer from. There was an overabundance of characters. It was almost painfully slow to start the book. Almost painfully slow. There was a substantial lack of editing. There was a lot of stuff that really could and probably should have hit the cutting room floor with this book. But Stephen King usually tends not to do that. He really likes to stretch his legs a lot. Regardless of my complaints, I mean, it was still fine. It was still Stephen King. And, mediocre Stephen King is still better than a number of other authors that I've read at their peak. Stephen King has called himself the literary equivalent of a Big Mac and fries. And I think that he sells himself a little bit short. The Big Mac and fries thing is pretty on the nose for Fairy Tale, right? Stephen King has written some truly substantial stories, something that is far better than the Big Mac and fries claim that he's made about himself. I would argue that The Stand is actually genuinely deep and moving. Same thing with same thing with The Dark Tower. Fairy Tale was okay. It was slightly above average. Fairy Tale, I think I'm gonna give it a C+. Far from the best thing he's written, far from the worst thing he's written. It is just straight, middle-of-the-road Stephen King. Am I going to reread this book? No, probably not. Again, it wasn't terrible, but there are so many more books that I'm more curious about that I know that I'm going to enjoy more trying to read for the first time than I will enjoy reading this one for the second time. And, if I'm gonna reread Stephen King, I'm going to reread something I know for a fact that I loved. I'm going to reread Insomnia. I'm going to reread The Regulators. I'm gonna reread The Stand, or It, or Under the Dome. There's a tried and true Stephen King that I absolutely love that I will go back to. Fairy Tale is not going to be one of them. One book that I do have to return to all the time is The Circus, an American Fantasy, because that's my book. Surprise, I'm gonna sell you shit. The Circus, an American Fantasy is my debut novel. Set in an otherworldly circus where souls are currency, Penny Robinson has to bend to the whim of a circus dictator or risk her life to try and escape with her soul. We also have portraits in Bloodlines. Inside is 23 short stories of the horror, fantasy, science fiction, and other genres. A little bit of everything for everyone in Portraits and Bloodlines. I'm also going to be at the Artists Assemble Horror Fest in Mesa, Arizona. That's October 11th to 13th, 2024. If you enjoyed watching this shit, you can also go take a look at when I reviewed The Talisman. The Talisman was fucking excellent. Thanks for being here, man. I appreciate y'all watching on through. What are you reading right now? I would love to know, because I love talking about books. Talking about books is probably my favorite thing in the entire fucking world. I'm reading Hard as Nails by Dan Simmons. Anyway, thank you for being here. But, maybe, hey, there's my dad sneezing.